The hold of the American transport ship smelled of rust, salt, and something sour. Old oil soaked into wood, damp uniforms, stale breath thick in the air. Somewhere below the surface of the Pacific, the engines rumbled like distant thunder, constant and inescapable. It was not the sound of death, though the women believed it was. It was only the sound of a journey beginning, though they could not know where it would end. Keiko Tanaka pressed her hand flat against the cold steel wall beside her, seeking something solid as the pain pulsed through her hips. Her muscles ached from days of hard sitting and from something deeper, something that lived in the bruises beneath her skin, remnants of captivity not by the Americans, but by her own people's silence. She shifted just barely. The pain lanced through her again. She winced, a whisper from across the hold. "Does it hurt too?" A woman in her 20s, draped in a tattered kimono, sat knees drawn to her chest. Keiko recognized her from the camp. The textile workers, some said. Civilians, barely past girlhood. No soldiers, no saboteurs. But here they were, 24 Japanese women packed into the belly of an American ship, waiting to die. "Yes," Keiko answered softly after a pause. "It hurts when I sit." A few of the women stirred at the sound of voices, but most remained silent, eyes closed, heads bowed, not in prayer, but in fear. It was the silence of a people waiting to be judged. For weeks, they had heard the stories. The Americans were devils, barbarians. If captured, the women were told, they would be stripped, violated, mutilated. American soldiers drank the blood of Japanese prisoners. They laughed as they cut women open. There were pamphlets, murals, even school songs warning of the enemy's cruelty. The women had memorized every one. Keiko had believed them all. She remembered the final moments on the island. Saipan, the flames, the women who leapt from cliffs, mothers carrying children on their backs, officers shouting, "Better to die than be defiled." She had watched a friend put a grenade to her chest and pull the pin. But Keiko had not jumped. She had not pulled the pin. Instead, she had surrendered. There were 23 others like her. Women found hiding in caves, in hospitals, in the wreckage of what was once a factory, now shattered by bombs. They were pulled from darkness by men in olive drab who shouted in a language they didn't understand. Now they waited. The ship rocked again, more gently now. Outside, someone barked orders. The clang of boots on the deck above echoed down like falling stones. The women held their breath. Keiko thought of her father, a school teacher. He had once told her, "A warrior fears not death, but dishonor." But was surrender dishonor? Or was it merely survival? She looked around. One woman was crying silently into her sleeve. Another clutched a photograph of a child, the ink smudged from sweat. The rest stared into the dimness, waiting for the hatch to open. Time passed like dripping water. And then, a creak, a shaft of light. The hatch above was lifted, and pale sunlight spilled into the darkness. The women squinted, recoiling instinctively. They expected rifles, yelling, cold steel, but it was none of those. Instead, a voice, low, calm, and unfamiliar, called down to them in broken Japanese. "Ladies, food, come." For a long moment, no one moved. Keiko felt her pulse in her throat. The air shifted. The spell of silence, of dread, began to fray. A shadow descended. One of the soldiers, helmet off, arms bare, carrying a large metal bucket. He walked down slowly, carefully, as if not to frighten them. The women leaned away. He placed the bucket in the center of the room. A ladle clinked against the side. Steam curled into the air. Soup, actual hot soup. The soldier didn't smile. He simply nodded once, respectfully, and walked back up the stairs without a word. No lock was turned behind him. The hatch remained open. Light poured down like grace. Keiko stared at the soup as if it were a mirage. Her stomach tightened, not with hunger, but disbelief. She crawled forward on aching knees, dipped the ladle, and brought it to her lips. It was warm, salty. There were bits of rice, carrot, even a sliver of chicken. Her throat tightened. She looked up. Others were watching her. Keiko nodded, just once. The women began to move. At first, they shuffled in silence, unsure whether to trust the warmth rising from the battered soup pot. One by one, they crouched near it like animals unsure if a hand offered food or punishment. No one spoke. No one dared. Then, a second sound. Footsteps again. Not hurried, not angry. Not the boots of conquerors, but the dull rubber thump of canvas shoes. Another American soldier appeared above the hatch. This one was younger. His face was red from the sun, and his arms bare beneath rolled sleeves. His helmet was gone, and in its place was a wide basin of metal clutched in both hands. Steam rose from it like incense from a shrine. Hot water. He descended slowly, eyes scanning the women, not with suspicion, but with something like concern. He placed the basin gently beside the soup bucket, then reached into his pocket. A small bar of soap, still wrapped in tan paper, emerged in his palm. Faint English letters were stamped on its surface. U.S. Army. Issue. He held it up, not like an order, but an offering. Wash, he said gently. You can wash now. Keiko froze. She looked at the soap like it was an artifact from another world. No one moved. The air was still. For a moment, no one understood. Then the soldier unwrapped the paper, dipped the bar in the water, rubbed it between his hands, and held the soapy foam out toward them. A single step back, a flinch. To wash in front of a man? Keiko's breath caught. She remembered the warnings. That capture meant humiliation. That Americans would strip them bare, laugh as they degraded them. Her heart pounded. Her body tightened. But the man didn't leer. He didn't touch. He waited. Then he turned around. He placed the soap gently on the floor, took a step back, and climbed the stairs again, disappearing into daylight. Silence. Then, the faintest sound, like water falling on stone. One woman had moved. She dipped her fingers into the warm basin and brought it to her face. A shiver passed through her body. She rubbed at the grime across her cheeks, her neck, her ears. Others followed. Quietly, reverently, Keiko approached the basin last. She knelt. The water smelled faintly of iron and salt and soap. She cupped it in both hands and brought it to her skin. Her cheeks were sunburned, her lips cracked. But the warmth, the kindness of the act was almost too much to bear. It wasn't just washing. It was being treated as human again. For weeks, they had lived like ghosts, hunted through caves, fed once a day, barely. They had not bathed since the Americans landed. Their hair was tangled with dust and leaves, their fingernails crusted with earth. They had begun to forget what it felt like to be clean, to be warm, to be women. Now, in the belly of an enemy ship, they found it again. Not through orders, not through force, but through soap. A few of them wept silently, heads bowed over the basin. It wasn't shame. It was the breaking of something deeper, an idea forged in them since birth. The Americans were supposed to be monsters, but monsters didn't bring hot water. Monsters didn't look away when women washed. Monsters didn't leave the hatch open so that light and breeze could drift down into the hold like a memory of freedom. That evening, the soldier returned. He brought blankets, rough, woolen, military issue, but folded in clean squares, one for each woman. He didn't speak. He didn't look long. He set them down and left. Keiko clutched hers tightly to her chest, even though the hold was still warm from the day's sun. The smell of detergent, strange and foreign, filled her nose. She laid on her side that night, wrapped in the blanket, and listened to the breathing of the others. It had changed. No longer ragged gasps of fear. Now, slower, softer. Somewhere near the basin, someone began to hum. A child's lullaby, barely audible. No one silenced her. Keiko closed her eyes, and for the first time in many nights, sleep found her without violence. But deeper than sleep, a question stirred. If the Americans were not monsters, then what else might be false? The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, the hatch creaked open again. A new voice this time, sharper, more formal. On deck, one by one, slowly. The words came in broken Japanese. The tone wasn't cruel, but it was firm, military. Keiko stirred under her blanket. The floor of the hold had grown damp with ocean sweat, and the air smelled again of metal and breath. She sat up slowly, joints stiff. Around her, the others roused with quiet rustles, some blinking in confusion, some looking up with wide, uncertain eyes. "To be shot," one woman whispered. "No," another replied, more to calm herself than to offer truth. They would not feed us first. They moved without resistance. One by one, the women climbed the narrow metal stairs toward the light. Keiko followed, the last to ascend. As her head emerged past the hatch, the wind struck her like a wave, salty, fresh, and full of life. For a moment, she could not breathe. The sun, still low on the horizon, poured gold across the steel deck. The ocean glittered in every direction. It was the first time she'd seen the sky in 4 days. She stepped out. The brightness made her squint, and she instinctively raised a hand to shield her eyes. And then she froze. They were everywhere. American sailors, hundreds, stood across the deck, along the rails, beside the towers. Some paused from work. Others leaned casually on ropes or sat cross-legged near open hatches. They all watched. Keiko's throat tightened. So this was it, the spectacle, the shame. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Even though she still wore her thin blouse and skirt, the others had done the same, huddling beneath the scratchy wool-like armor. She dared not meet their eyes. Then she noticed something strange. The Americans weren't laughing. They weren't whispering or pointing or jeering. They were silent. Not one smile, not one mocking gesture. Some looked away the moment their eyes met hers. Others simply nodded once, solemn, almost respectful, before turning back to their tasks. She scanned the deck. There were no cameras, no soldiers barking orders, no guards forcing the women into humiliating lines. Instead, a young Navy officer gestured to a stretch of empty deck near the bow, far from the machinery and ropes. "You walk," he said gently. "Exercise, stretch legs." The words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakable. Concern. The women glanced at one another, and then, hesitantly, they began to move. Slowly at first, like fawns stepping onto unfamiliar earth. The deck beneath them was warm from the morning sun, and the breeze carried the scent of salt and diesel. 1 or 2 women walked in silence, eyes downward. Another held the hand of an older woman as they paced a slow circle around the edge. No one chased them. No one shouted. From the corner of her eye, Keiko caught a sailor standing near a coil of rope. He looked young, no more than 19. His hands were stained with grease, and he wore a crooked smile that vanished the moment she looked his way. He bowed his head slightly, as if embarrassed. She didn't understand it. Where was the hatred, the triumph? These were the men who had firebombed her island, who had dropped steel rain from the sky, who had conquered with noise and fury. But now, one of them brought out a crate. Inside were canvas shoes. Simple, plain, some too large, others too small. They set the box down beside the group and backed away. "No more bare feet," the sailor said, this time in English, then pointed to the shoes and tapped his own. It took a moment. Then a woman stepped forward. She picked a pair, bowed slightly. The others followed. Keiko found a set that fit almost right. She didn't know what moved her more, the comfort or the gesture. After 20 minutes, the officer called gently, "Down now, more soup later." They returned to the hatch in silence, their footsteps softer now. Not from fear, but from awe. As Keiko reached the stairs, she paused. One last look back. The sailor by the ropes was watching her again. This time, he offered a gesture, something she'd never seen before. He raised his fingers to his forehead, then flicked them outward. A salute? A wave? She didn't know. But she bowed her head slightly before descending back into the hold. Below, the others had already begun talking, softly. Not about death, not about shame, but about what they had seen. The sky, the sea, and the eyes of men who were not monsters. The next morning began with wind. The Pacific was restless, the kind of slow swell that makes the horizon breathe. A few of the women had begun to stand on their own, their sea legs steadier now. The air in the hold no longer smelled like fear. It smelled of soap, wool, and faint traces of broth. When the hatch opened this time, there was laughter above. Men's laughter, easy and bright, not cruel. Then came a scraping sound, like metal sliding on wood. A shadow fell across the opening. Keiko looked up. A single soldier descended, balancing a dented tin cup on a tray. He moved slowly, careful not to spill. His uniform was open at the neck, his face pink from windburn. He looked almost boyish, his hair sticking to his forehead. He held the cup out toward the group. "Drink," he said, then pointed at his mouth. "Good." No one moved. The women watched him with suspicion. They had seen Americans drink strange dark liquids from metal mugs on deck, steam curling from the rim. They had been told Americans filled their cups with whiskey, that they drank until they lost all mercy. The soldier waited a moment, then crouched, holding the cup lower. Steam rose between them, carrying a smell unlike anything Keiko had ever known. Bitter, earthy, alive. Coffee. He took a sip himself, exaggeratedly, to show it was safe. Then he wiped the rim with his sleeve and held it out again. The women exchanged glances. The older one, Mrs. Sato, shook her head. "It could be a trick," she whispered. But Keiko, without quite knowing why, reached out. The metal was warm against her palms. The scent was deeper now, sharper, almost intoxicating. She hesitated, and then took the smallest sip. Her eyes widened. It was bitter. So bitter it almost hurt her tongue. But underneath the bitterness was warmth. Something strange, something human. She coughed softly, then, against all instinct, laughed. The sound startled even her. The soldier smiled, just barely. "Good?" he asked again, pointing at the cup. Keiko nodded. The others leaned in. One by one, they tried it. Faces twisted, eyes watered. A few spat it back, sputtering. But then came the second taste, when bitterness turned to heat, to a steady burn that spread down into the chest. Laughter bubbled up again. Not mockery this time, but something fragile, trembling, like a song remembered after years of silence. For the first time since the war began, they laughed without permission. The soldier seemed to understand. He grinned, bowed slightly, and climbed back to the deck. The cup remained. The women passed it between them, each sip a kind of disbelief. Hot water, soap, blankets, now this, Mrs. Sato murmured. "Maybe we died already. Maybe this is heaven." "No," Keiko said softly. "Heaven doesn't taste like this." The others laughed again, nervous, breathless, but real. The ship rocked gently. Above them, footsteps moved in rhythm, the hum of engines steady as a heartbeat. For a long while, they said nothing more. They just sat together in the dim hold, passing the cup, feeling warmth spread through hands and stomachs that had forgotten such a thing existed. As the last of the coffee cooled, a sailor's voice called from above, "Up deck again." This time they climbed with less fear. The sky was blinding, endless. The sea stretched out like liquid glass. Sailors worked on ropes and guns, but now they greeted the women with nods, sometimes a smile. Someone even tossed an apple toward them. Clumsy, underhanded, rolling across the deck until a young girl caught it in surprise. Keiko watched as two sailors shared a cigarette by the railing, trading it back and forth between drags. When one noticed her gaze, he turned away. Not out of contempt, but modesty, as though ashamed to be caught in such an ordinary moment. Then she saw him, the same soldier who had brought the coffee. He was leaning against the bulkhead, arms crossed. When he saw her, he mimed drinking again and smiled. She smiled back. For a heartbeat, the ocean noise faded. There was no language, no flag, no war. Only two people acknowledging each other across an impossible divide. Later, back below deck, one of the younger women whispered, "Why do they not hate us?" Keiko didn't answer. She sat with her hands folded around the now empty cup, feeling its fading warmth. The metal was cool again, but she could still smell the coffee. Its strange, foreign scent, clinging to her fingers like memory. She thought of her mother's words. The world ends when you forget your enemy is human. But here, in the hold of an American ship, surrounded by the sound of waves and the scent of bitter coffee, Keiko realized something terrifying and beautiful. She could no longer remember what hatred felt like. That night, the wind changed. The ship rocked harder. The waves slapped metal like distant drums, and the hold trembled with every roll. Sleep came in pieces. Thin, restless pieces wrapped in wool and memory. Keiko sat awake in the dark. Her lower back ached. Her thighs still burned from days of crouching, of cold, of fear. She leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes. The scent of coffee still lingered faintly in the air, clinging to her blanket like a secret. A sudden clatter broke the stillness. The hatch creaked open. This time, it was not a soldier who descended, but a man in white, a different color entirely. No rifle, no helmet. Only a canvas medical bag slung over one shoulder and something in his hands. Bandages. He was older than the others. Gray at the temples, with a tiredness in his posture that didn't look like defeat. He knelt slowly, placing the bag beside him, then spoke quietly in English. "Medic," he said, tapping his chest. "I help." The women froze. One shifted behind Keiko. Another tucked her feet under her blanket. The older woman, Mrs. Sato, shook her head silently. She had been wounded, the limp in her leg worsening each day. But she would not move. The medic saw this. He opened the bag anyway. Out came small bottles, gauze, and cloth strips. A faint, sharp scent filled the air. Alcohol, antiseptic, medicine. Keiko remembered that smell from childhood. Once when she'd scraped her knee on a stone path. Her father had dabbed her wound with sake and tied it in silk. She had cried, not from pain, but from shame. The memory flashed and was gone. The medic looked up, locking eyes with her, not pleading, not ordering, just waiting. She did not know what moved her, but she stepped forward. She knelt in front of him, slowly. Her ankle was raw from when she'd tripped during the shelling on Saipan. She had hidden the wound for days. The man gestured with open palms. "Okay?" She nodded. He reached toward her, not with force, not with command, but with cloth. And then, the strangest thing happened. He touched her skin, not like a captor, not like a victor, but like a healer. Gentle, careful. Each movement deliberate, slow. He unwrapped the edge of her bandage, soiled, stuck with dried blood, and replaced it with something clean, soft. His fingers did not linger. His eyes did not roam. He dipped gauze in antiseptic and dabbed it onto her skin. It stung. She flinched. "Sorry," he said quietly. It was the first apology she'd ever heard from the enemy. The moment passed in silence. Then he wrapped the fresh cloth around her ankle, knotted it gently, and nodded once. Better? Keiko couldn't speak. Something cracked behind her. A sharp, wet sound. She turned. Mrs. Sada was crying, not weeping, not wailing, just tears, falling down an old woman's cheeks without permission. The medic looked up. His eyes softened. He moved toward her slowly. She didn't stop him. He bent beside her and reached for her injured leg. She let him. The cloth of her trousers had fused with a wound near the calf. He whispered something, words she couldn't understand. But the tone felt like asking. She gave the smallest nod. He began. The others watched as he worked. No one moved. It was as if they were witnessing a ritual, something sacred, something too human for war. When the old woman's wound was cleaned and wrapped, the medic pressed her hand gently and stood. He looked around once more. No triumph, no pride, only fatigue. Then he left. The hatch closed behind him, but the silence he left behind was different. No longer fear. Grief, deep grief, because now they knew what kindness felt like, and with it came unbearable questions. Why had they never been taught this? Why had they been told that mercy was weakness? Why had they chosen suicide over this? Keiko leaned against the wall, her fresh bandage warm under her blanket. She remembered the officers screaming in the final days. Fight until the last breath. The enemy will rape your soul. But the only thing these men had taken was pain. That night, no one spoke. The silence became sacred, a silence of unlearning, of grieving for lies, of mourning the hatred they had been born into. Keiko touched her ankle. The cloth was soft. Her heart was softer. That evening, after the soup had been ladled and the blankets folded back into place, the hatch opened again, but this time no one called. Instead, a young sailor simply stood at the top, silhouetted in twilight, his body leaning on the edge of the opening as the scent of sea wind drifted down like the first note of a lullaby. He tapped the metal hatch with his knuckles. Then he gestured upward, a question, not a command. "Sky?" he said. "Come see." The women hesitated. They had just begun to learn that mercy could wear olive drab. But trust, that took longer to grow than bruises took to fade. Still, slowly they rose. Keiko was among the first. Her ankle, wrapped cleanly now, didn't sting as before. She climbed the stairs carefully, hand brushing the cool rail. She emerged onto the deck. A hush fell around her. The sky had changed. The sun was gone, tucked below the ocean's edge. But the stars had not yet claimed the night. Instead, a deep blue velvet stretched in every direction, tinged with gold along the horizon. And just above the edge of the sea, lights, distant, faint, but unmistakable. One woman gasped. "What is that?" she whispered in Japanese. A sailor nearby heard the tone, if not the words. He pointed to the glowing smear in the distance, blinking gently in clusters like swarming fireflies. "Base," he said. "Island, close." Guam, perhaps, or Tinian, maybe even the mainland. The women stared. Some had never seen electric light across water before. Not like this. Not spread in clusters so wide, so calm, so human. It didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like home. "Is that where they live?" a girl asked. Keiko didn't answer. But inside, something cracked again. She thought of the drawings in her old schoolbook. Grotesque cartoons of Americans with horns and red eyes, stomping Japanese flags beneath clawed feet. She had believed them. Believed their homes must be caves, their families brutes, their souls empty. But now she looked at those distant lights, too far to touch, too soft to fear. And she wondered what kind of children lived beneath them. Did they eat rice like hers had? Did they run barefoot through grass, laughing over nothing? Did their mothers worry when they caught colds? The wind picked up, brushing hair from their faces. One of the older women held her blanket closer and whispered, "They live like we do." It wasn't an accusation. It was an awakening. Down the deck, sailors moved quietly around them. No one shouted. No one interrupted. One offered a canteen of water to a young woman with dry lips. Another pointed to the stars, murmuring names: Orion, Cassiopeia. Words none of the women understood, but whose reverence they did. The stars were the same, the water too. Keiko looked down at her hands, once clenched in hatred, now open, still smelling faintly of soap and coffee. She had grown up with war songs, with the thunder of drums and the promise of sacrifice. She remembered her teacher saying, "You are the daughter of the empire. You will fight with your eyes, your breath, your silence if needed." But here she stood, barefoot in borrowed shoes, wrapped in a wool blanket handed to her by her enemy. And the sky had not fallen. She turned toward the soldier who had first beckoned them above. He stood quietly, arms crossed, watching the sea. "Why are you kind?" she asked in slow Japanese. He didn't understand, but something in her voice made him look at her, really look. And then, slowly, he reached into his pocket. Out came a photograph, creased, black and white. He handed it to her. A woman and a child, smiling, standing beneath a tree in summer sun. The child held something in his hands, a paper airplane. Keiko's breath caught. The soldier tapped the photo gently. "My wife," he said. Then, "My boy." She held the image in both hands. It trembled. He looked out to the sea and added softly, "I fight so they don't have to." She bowed, a small motion. A mountain of meaning. No more was said. The lights on the horizon blinked again. Calm, distant, steady, like home. That night, when the women returned to the hold, no one cried. No one whispered warnings. They lay side by side in a silence that was no longer fear, but reflection. One woman hummed a lullaby, another prayed. Keiko sat with a photo in her lap, returned by the soldier, but not forgotten, and stared at her fingers. She no longer knew where enemy ended and person began. Morning broke soft and silver, the kind of light that turns steel into water. The ship's engines hummed beneath the floor like a great animal asleep. The air inside the hold was warmer now, gentler. The smell of salt mixed with faint traces of medicine and boiled rice. For the first time since their capture, the women no longer woke in terror. Some sat cross-legged, combing their hair with fingers. Others folded their blankets neatly, as if instinct still demanded order, even in uncertainty. Keiko sat near the hatch, her hands clasped around her knees. Her eyes followed the beam of light that slipped through a crack in the metal, one slender line stretching from floor to wall. She had begun to measure time by it. Then softly a voice broke the quiet. It belonged to one of the younger women, barely 20. Her name was Aiko. She had been a nurse's assistant before the invasion, still girlish in her features, still fragile from hunger. "If they are good," she whispered. "Does that mean we were lied to?" The words hung there. They were small words, but they changed everything. No one answered. The sound of the sea filled the silence that followed. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Sato looked down at her bandaged leg. "We were told they would hurt us," she murmured. But they did not. Another woman, eyes hollow, added, "We were told they would defile us, but they looked away." The room seemed to tilt, not from the waves, but from the weight of thought. Keiko felt it too, the shifting of something inside her. She remembered the radio broadcasts that had filled the air back home, the deep male voices declaring divine victory, the warnings that surrender was a sin against the emperor, the posters showing Americans as beasts. She remembered how she had sung those songs without question, how she had believed them as firmly as she believed in sunrise. And now, sitting in the belly of an American ship, drinking their coffee and wearing their shoes, she realized something terrifying. If one lie could crumble, then perhaps all could. Her stomach nodded, not from fear but from awakening. Aiko spoke again, louder this time. If they are kind, then what were we fighting? No one met her eyes. They all stared at the floor. Only Keiko finally answered, her voice thin as thread. Maybe we fought because we were told to. And maybe they did too. The simplicity of it made some look up. A war of orders, a war of illusions. Not gods, not demons. Just people carrying flags. A long moment passed. Then Mrs. Sato gave a quiet, broken laugh. 40 years old, she said. And only now do I see that the world is bigger than the emperor's portrait. No one laughed with her, but the air eased just slightly. The kind of easing that follows the first crack in stone. Above them, footsteps crossed the deck, steady, human, alive. Keiko thought of the soldier's photograph, the boy with the paper airplane. She wondered if Japanese children somewhere were holding the same toys, dreaming of skies their fathers had filled with smoke. What if all fathers wanted the same thing? To return. The thought frightened her. Because if that were true, then the war wasn't between nations. It was between illusions. For the rest of the morning, no one spoke. They simply existed, breathing, waiting, thinking. Near noon, the hatch opened again. The same medic appeared, the one with the gray hair and tired eyes. He carried a crate this time. Inside were small items: soap, cloth, a few combs, tins of food. He placed it down without a word. Aiko approached first. She reached for one of the tins, then hesitated. "Why give?" she asked in broken English. The medic shrugged lightly. "Because you are alive." The words were simple, but they landed like a stone in still water. Because you are alive, not because you surrendered, not because you were weak, simply because life, even in defeat, deserved care. Aiko bowed deeply. When the medic left, she whispered, "They do not see us as shame." Keiko looked around at the faces in the dim light, faces she had known through terror and hunger. They no longer looked like prisoners. They looked like people remembering how to exist. But remembering is painful, because memory demands honesty. That night, Keiko couldn't sleep. The ship rocked gently, and the line of light had vanished into darkness. She stared upward at the iron ceiling and felt the weight of everything she had believed pressed down upon her like the Pacific itself. Her thoughts spoke in her father's voice. A warrior fears not death, but dishonor. Yet what if survival, accepting kindness from an enemy, was not dishonor at all? What if it was courage? She pressed her hand against her chest and whispered to no one, "I don't know who I am anymore." But perhaps that was the beginning. For the first time, she wasn't repeating a lesson. She was asking one. Outside, the waves whispered against the hull, steady as breath. The sound was the same on every shore, Japanese or American, conqueror or conquered. The world was wider than she'd been told, and truth, she realized, was not a flag or a song. It was a small light in the dark. Like those fireflies on the horizon, the sea does not care for revelations. It does not wait for healing. It rolls forward, ancient and untamed, sweeping away both hatred and understanding alike. That night, it reminded them. The storm came without warning. The ship shuddered as wind slammed against its flank. Thunder cracked like distant artillery. Rain tore sideways across the deck, and waves rose like black mountains, slamming the hull with the fury of gods no longer worshipped. Below in the hold, darkness swallowed every voice. Metal groaned. The lights flickered and went out. A scream, then another. Keiko clutched the iron wall as the floor shifted violently beneath her. Someone fell hard beside her, perhaps Aiko, and cried out in pain. The crates slid. Water began seeping in through the seams, cold and sharp. The hatch above remained open, but the night sky beyond was pure chaos. Then a violent tilt, left, then right again. The ship was being thrown, Keiko tried to rise but slipped, her shoulders slamming into the floor. The sound of crashing wood, of a woman sobbing, of metal striking metal, all rang out at once. For a moment, she thought it was another bombing. She felt the old fear return. The fear that had once lived in caves and air raid sirens. And then, above them, voices, American voices, yelling orders, running feet, hammering the deck. The hatch went white with lightning. Then, a figure appeared, one of the sailors. He descended like a ghost, soaked head to toe, rope slung across his shoulder, face smeared with rain and grease. He wasn't armed. He was shouting, pointing at the women, at the upper deck, then at the crates. Another voice followed, then another. 3 soldiers now. They were trying to move the supplies, trying to secure the food, the blankets, the water from being dashed into wreckage. The women stared, frozen. Another tilt. Sudden, sharp. A loud snap. A beam above cracked. One of the women screamed as a support rod gave way and came crashing down toward her. Before she could move, one of the Americans lunged forward and shoved her aside. The metal struck his shoulder, not hers. He grunted, hard, but stayed on his feet. She stared at him. He had bled for her. The storm did not stop, but something else did. The fear. Because in that moment, a man who wore the uniform of her enemy had risked his life for hers. Not out of duty, not out of triumph, but out of instinct, out of something older than war, compassion. Keiko crawled toward Aiko, whose lip was bleeding from a fall. She wrapped her arms around her tightly. The other sailor was tying crates together with rope. Another was handing out small flashlights from his belt, one for the women to see. He paused beside Keiko, held it out. She took it with trembling fingers. Their eyes met in a flash of lightning. In them, she saw no judgment, only exhaustion. And something like kinship. The chaos outside raged for another hour. Waves crashed, steel trembled, but within the hold, no one screamed anymore. They sat shoulder to shoulder, drenched and silent, cradling strangers' kindness in their hands like flame. When the storm finally passed, it was as if the ship exhaled. Wind softened, rain tapered into mist. The hatch above was still open. Stars returned. A medic came down, not with supplies, but with towels. The sailor who'd taken the beam to the shoulder was bandaged and back on his feet, limping slightly. The woman he'd saved, Mrs. Fujiko, refused to stop staring at him. She had not spoken since the Americans pulled her from the rubble. Now, in a voice barely louder than breath, she said, "Why would a devil save me?" No one answered, because the answer was already known. No devil had touched her. A man had, flawed, tired, bleeding, but human. The final wall was gone, not shattered in argument, not debated in philosophy, but torn down by a storm. And what stood in its place was something no doctrine could erase. Keiko looked around the hold that night and saw not captives, not victims, but survivors. Connected now not by language or loyalty, but by a single truth. Pain had been shared, and through it, so had grace. By the 3rd week at sea, the women no longer looked like prisoners. Their hair, though tangled, had been combed with fingertips, their wounds wrapped in clean cloth. They spoke more often now. Soft voices, little stories, quiet laughter that echoed off the walls of the hold like birds returning to a forest after fire. Keiko no longer flinched when boots crossed the deck above. She no longer waited for commands, barked in anger. The sound of Americans working, coughing, shouting orders to one another, sharing cigarettes, was now the backdrop to her thoughts, not the threat within them. Then came the morning. The engine slowed. The ship groaned like an old beast returning from battle. Someone opened the hatch, but not with urgency. The light was soft. The voice above was calm. "Disembark," the soldier said. "We're here." No shouting, no chains, just those 2 words. "We're here." Keiko stepped onto the deck and saw it. Land, a curved shoreline lined with trees. Trucks, barracks, flags fluttering on tall poles. An American base, One of the sailors pointed to a wooden platform at the end of the gangplank. There stood a table, 2 chairs, a clipboard, a fountain pen. A few soldiers in clean uniforms stood waiting, not with rifles, but with forms and water canteens. The women hesitated again. Then something happened that no one expected. An officer stepped forward, clean-shaven, gray hair tucked neatly under his cap. He held a sheet of paper and cleared his throat. And then he began to read, slowly, carefully, names, but not numbers, not ranks, not female prisoner 14. Names, real names. Tanaka, Keiko. Her breath caught in her throat. He looked up and repeated it, slower. Tanaka. Keiko. It was not perfect. His vowels were round, the consonants heavy. But the attempt, his effort to speak her name, made her knees weak. She stepped forward. The officer didn't look through her. He looked at her, eyes steady, voice firm. You are Tanaka, Keiko? She nodded. He checked the box beside her name. Then he extended his hand. For a moment, Keiko did not move. The idea of touch, of shaking hands with the enemy. But it wasn't the enemy that stood before her. It was a man, a soldier, a stranger who had bothered to say her name as if it mattered. She placed her hand in his. He didn't squeeze, just held it for a moment, then released. He pointed to a tent where another woman, an American nurse, stood beside a stack of fresh clothes. Clean uniforms. You're safe now, he said. It's over. She walked 1 step at a time toward the tent. Behind her, the next name was called. Sato Mariko. A pause. Then Sato Mariko. The same tone, the same effort. And from the women, the same response. They cried, not with sobs, not with screams, just tears, silent, steady, as their names, their real names, passed through foreign mouths without mockery. Each time, a little more of the war crumbled. Each time, something inside them stood taller. Aiko whispered to Keiko as they waited near the tent. They know who we are, not as enemies, as people. Keiko nodded. In the nurse's tent, the women were given new clothing, loose-fitting cotton garments, basic but clean. One by one, they were asked about their health. Asked, not ordered. A nurse handed Keiko a small slip of paper. On it was written, in careful English and handwritten Japanese, "You are being transferred to a civilian processing center. No harm will come to you. We will help you return home when the war ends." Keiko stared at the words. Her lips moved as she sounded them out. Home, return, help. Words she never imagined would come from the enemy. One woman clutched the paper to her chest and began to sob. The Americans didn't stop her. One even placed a hand gently on her shoulder and simply said, "Okay. Cry." It was the first time anyone had given them permission to feel. And the name-calling continued, one by one, woman by woman. No shouts, no batons, no lines of barbed wire, only names. Names spoken aloud so the world could hear, "You are still someone. You are not erased." When the list was finished, the clipboard closed. The women were led toward the trucks, not like cargo, but like passengers. There was food, water, a promise of rest. Keiko climbed aboard the last vehicle, the wind gently stirring her hair. She looked back at the ship, gray, rusted, tired, but now sacred. The place where myths had died and truth had risen. She turned to Aiko. "They gave us back something I thought was lost forever," she said. Aiko frowned gently. "What?" Keiko looked at her own hands, still rough, still trembling, but unmistakably hers. A name. The camp was quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the silence that follows storms. The kind that lingers over fields after thunder, where the only sound is wind through dry leaves and the breath of someone still alive. Keiko sat on a wooden bench beneath a slatted roof, the sun low behind her. Her feet touched earth again, not metal, not warship decking, but earth, soft, red-brown, and warm. A breeze carried the scent of the sea, cleaner now, gentler. Somewhere beyond the fence, waves folded onto a quiet beach. The tide, like memory, came and went without permission. She sat with her knees drawn close, wrapped in the simple American uniform they had given her. Her name, her full name, had been written in careful ink on a small tag clipped to her collar. Not stamped, not assigned. Written, as if someone meant to remember her. She still hurt when she sat. Her hips ached. The bruises along her thighs had faded, but the bones remembered. Her body, like her heart, was still healing. But the pain was no longer punishment. It was simply pain. She looked out across the camp. The barracks were modest. Whitewashed walls, canvas roofs. But they stood open. No barbed wire, no watchtowers. The guards walked with hands on hips, not on weapons. They nodded at the women. Sometimes they smiled. Sometimes they said, "Morning," as if it were that simple. One of the nurses passed by, a tall American woman with freckled arms and tired eyes. She offered Keiko a small cup of water. Keiko bowed slightly and took it. The nurse didn't speak. She didn't need to. Keiko drank slowly. She watched the dust settle on the road. She listened to the distant thrum of a generator, the call of birds unfamiliar to her ears, and, beneath it all, the ocean. Always the ocean. In that sound, she heard what she hadn't been able to before. She heard the voice of her mother, calling her name at dusk. She heard the breath of her friend Yui, lost on the cliffs of Saipan. She heard the echo of soldiers shouting lies, and the whisper of a medic saying, "Because you are alive." Aiko sat beside her now, scribbling quietly in a small notebook the Americans had given her. She was learning English, practicing letters, copying phrases. Keiko watched her for a while, then asked, "What will you do when we go home?" Aiko paused. Then, without looking up, she said, "I don't know what home is anymore." Keiko nodded. She too had begun to wonder. Home had once meant obedience, flags, songs, bows so deep they broke the neck. But those things felt far away now, like shadows burned off by morning sun. Home now was this: a warm drink shared, a voice calling your name, the simple mercy of being seen. She thought of the soldier who had shared his coffee, of the medic who bandaged her ankle, of the man who tried to pronounce Tanaka with care. She would never forget those hands. She would never forget the storm. And the sailor who shielded Mrs. Fujiko with his own body. She would never forget the silence in the hold after Aiko asked, "If they are good, were we lied to?" Because the lie had died there. It had not been defeated in battle. It had not been shot or captured. It had simply withered in the presence of truth, a shadow that dissolved under human light. Keiko stood and walked to the fence. Not a wall, not a prison gate. Just wire strung between posts, open at the end where a guard sat on a wooden chair reading a magazine. He looked up, nodded, and returned to the page. She gazed out toward the sea. The sun was dipping now, its light skimming across the surface like a coin tossed into the future. Waves rolled in, soft and slow. Somewhere beyond that water, Japan waited. The place that had raised her, taught her, lied to her. She still loved it, but not as she had before, not blindly. Now she loved it as one loves an aging parent, flawed, wounded, still beautiful, but no longer right about everything. She whispered to no one, "I will go home," but not the same. Behind her, Aiko called her name, not shouted, called, softly, a name. Keiko turned and smiled. The story had begun in silence and terror, in bruises and trembling, in the belly of a steel ship, where 24 women believed they were being taken to die. But they had not died. They had lived. And what they found in the hold of that enemy vessel was not hatred, but healing. Not punishment, but recognition. Not shame, but dignity. Keiko walked back to the bench and sat again, slowly, carefully. Yes, it still hurt when she sat, but now she knew why. Because bones remember, but hearts can be reborn. The sound of wind passed gently through the trees, and the sea kept singing.